There's something fascinating happening in American psychology right now. We obsess over baby boomers retiring. We analyze millennials' economic anxiety. We dissect Gen Z's digital native behaviors. But sandwiched between them sits a generation that holds 31% of all leadership positions despite making up only 20% of the adult population, Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. They're running companies, managing teams, and shaping policy. Yet they remain almost invisible in cultural conversations. Today, we're going deep into the psychological architecture of the most misunderstood generation in America, and what we find might explain everything from workplace dynamics to parenting styles to why they never post on Instagram. Generation X didn't just have working parents. They became test subjects in the largest unsupervised childhood experiment in modern American history. By 1984, approximately 7 million children between ages 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school, and researchers now estimate up to 40% of Gen X experienced this latchkey childhood. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't evenly distributed. According to research from the McCrindle Research Center, the higher the educational attainment of parents, the more likely their children were latchkey kids. Middle and upper-class Gen Zers were more likely to be unsupervised than their working-class counterparts because educated mothers were entering professional careers before childcare infrastructure existed. Think about the psychological impact. You're 8 years old, walking home alone, letting yourself in with a key around your neck. You microwave your own dinner. You do homework with no supervision. You resolve conflicts with siblings without adult mediation. And critically, you learn that asking for help isn't really an option because there's nobody there to ask. Psychologists call this a high-contingency environment, where actions and consequences connect directly without buffer time or adult intervention. Your brain develops different neural pathways around decision-making. You learn pattern recognition early. You develop what researchers identify as precocious independence, adult-level self-reliance while still in childhood. A systematic review of 15 peer-reviewed studies examining 5,267 participants found correlations between latchkey childhoods and later development of borderline personality disorder in some Gen Zers, particularly when combined with other adverse childhood experiences. But the research also shows something unexpected. Not all latchkey kids suffered. Studies from the 1990s found that latchkey children did about as well socially and emotionally as supervised peers when they came from stable homes overall. The key variable wasn't adult presence. It was family quality, emotional support, and whether children had clear guidelines for their unsupervised hours. This created a psychological bifurcation within Gen X. Some developed profound resilience and capability. Others developed attachment difficulties and self-reliance that borders on pathological independence. While Gen X was learning to fend for themselves at home, they were simultaneously watching every major institution betray the promises their parents believed in. Between 1960 and 1980, Gen X's formative years, the U.S. divorce rate more than doubled, peaking at 5.2 divorces per 1,000 people in 1980. Gen X children bore the brunt of this upheaval, becoming what sociologists call day orphans. But divorce was just the beginning. Gen X grew up watching institution after institution collapse. Corporate America betrayed the loyalty compact. Their parents gave decades to companies, only to be downsized in the 1980s and early 1990s. Gen X watched and learned that company loyalty is a one-way street. Between 1979 and 1995, U.S. companies eliminated more than 13 million jobs through downsizing and restructuring, and Gen X witnessed this carnage during their critical developmental years. The government proved fundamentally dishonest. Watergate happened when the oldest Gen Zers were still in elementary school. Iran-Contra, the AIDS crisis fumbling, corporate scandals like the Tylenol murders. Gen X absorbed these as normal background reality. The 24-hour CNN news cycle that emerged during their teenage years meant they consumed institutional failure as entertainment. Even science and technology failed them. The Challenger explosion in 1986 shattered the space program's invincibility. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster proved that even safe technology could kill you. Gen X learned early that expertise doesn't guarantee competence. This created what psychologists identify as defensive pessimism. a cognitive strategy where you expect negative outcomes not because you're cynical, but because you're protecting yourself from disappointment. Research shows Gen Zers score significantly higher on defensive pessimism than both boomers and millennials. But here's the twist. Defensive pessimism is actually an adaptive strategy. By expecting the worst, Gen Zers paradoxically perform better under pressure. They've already mentally prepared for failure, so they can focus energy on preventing it rather than managing anxiety about it. Generation X wasn't just psychologically shaped by childhood experiences. They were economically traumatized across their entire professional lives. Think about the timeline. The youngest Gen Zers graduated college right into the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 to 2001. The oldest ones were hitting peak earning years when the 2008 financial crisis struck. And unlike millennials, who at least got sympathy for their recession experiences, Gen X got neither sympathy nor recovery. Gen X was the first generation to be financially worse off than their parents in terms of retirement savings, wealth accumulation, cost of living, and upward mobility. Between ages 36 and 40, Gen Zers' real household incomes were only 16% higher than the previous generation at the same age, the smallest generational improvement ever recorded. The 2008 financial crisis hit Gen X particularly hard. They weren't fresh graduates like millennials who could move back home. They had mortgages, children, and career investments. According to research from the Longitudinal Study of American Life, younger Gen Zers accounted for 75% of people who lost homes to foreclosure during the recession. Federal Reserve data shows the sharpest decline in homeownership occurred not from boomers to millennials, but from boomers to Gen X. Between 2010 and 2021, millennials' net worth tripled in nominal terms, while Gen X's less than doubled. And the hits keep coming. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2033, precisely when the oldest Gen Zers reach retirement age. Many Gen X workers have spent their entire careers contributing to a system that may not exist when they need it. This economic battering created distinctive behavioral patterns. Gen Zers are significantly more likely than other generations to have multiple income streams, not from entrepreneurial spirit, but from survival instinct. They learned that no single source of income is reliable. They're also less likely to seek social support during financial stress. Research in the Journal of Adult Development shows Gen Zers report lower levels of seeking help during difficult periods, not because they lack people who'd help them, but because asking feels like admitting defeat. Here's where Gen X psychology gets really interesting. New data from Solston's psychological assessment database reveals that Gen X exhibits a unique trait profile that makes them particularly effective leaders, while simultaneously making them difficult to manage. According to Solston's analysis of psychological traits, Gen X scores higher on self-control than both millennials and Gen Z, with women scoring 49 and men scoring 46, higher than almost every other generation. They also show remarkably balanced ambition scores across genders, both scoring 51, unlike other generations where significant gender gaps exist. This explains why Gen X women and men pursue achievement with similar intensity, a pattern forged by watching gender barriers begin to collapse during their formative years. But the most revealing trait is their relationship with authority. Gen X doesn't respect titles, they respect competence. If you've earned your position through actual skill and knowledge, they'll follow you anywhere. If you're incompetent but credentialed, they have zero patience. This comes from watching authority figures lie throughout their entire childhood. From Nixon to Clinton, from corporate executives at Enron to officials fumbling the AIDS crisis, Gen X learned that people in power often don't know what they're doing and frequently lie about it. This creates unique workplace dynamics. Gen X managers tend to give their reports extreme autonomy, sometimes to a fault. They assume everyone else is as self-sufficient as they are. They hate micromanagement because they interpret it as evidence you don't trust their competence. According to Bridgeworks research, Gen X workers value being trusted to get the job done above almost all other workplace factors. When micromanaged, they're significantly more likely to quit than any other generation. They're also brutally honest in feedback. What millennials sometimes interpret as meanness is actually Gen X's direct communication style. They're not being cruel. They're giving you information they wish someone had given them when they were starting out. Before we had search engines, Gen X had libraries. And that difference fundamentally rewired how they process and value information. Imagine spending 3 hours in a library, hunting through card catalog drawers, tracking down a single book that might contain the answer to your question. You finally find it, photocopy the relevant pages, and bring them home. That information has weight, not just intellectual weight, but physical and temporal weight. You invested effort to obtain it. Cognitive psychologists call this deeper encoding. Information that requires effort to acquire becomes more permanently integrated into memory. Gen X doesn't just know things. They remember the effort it took to learn them, which creates different retention patterns. This extended to problem solving. When your bike chain broke, you didn't watch a YouTube tutorial. You flipped the bike upside down, got grease on your hands, examined how the components fit together, and figured it out through trial and error. This built mechanical intuition, a belief that with enough patience and examination, you can understand how physical systems work. According to Adobe's Future of Time report, Gen Zers quit jobs due to bad technology at rates 13 points higher than pre-COVID levels. Not because they're tech-averse, but because they have high standards for systems that actually work. This creates an interesting paradox. Gen X built the internet. They learned to code in BASIC as kids. They understand technology deeply, but they also remember what life was like without it, which makes them more discerning about when technology actually adds value versus when it just creates dependency. Now Gen X is raising the next generation, and their parenting style reveals everything about their psychology. Many Gen Zers vowed never to repeat their parents' mistakes. They would be present. They would engage. They would supervise. They would pay attention to their children's emotional needs in ways their own parents never did. And they've delivered on that promise, sometimes to extremes. Gen X parents are often the helicopter parents everyone complains about, not because they're controlling by nature, but because they're overcorrecting for their own childhood neglect. But there's a deep ambivalence in how they talk about this. Many Gen X parents simultaneously wonder if they've made their children too soft, too dependent, too fragile. In their worldview, being visible means being vulnerable, and they've made their children very visible through social media, scheduled activities, and constant supervision. Studies comparing parenting hours show Gen X parents spend approximately 2 to 3 times more hours per week on direct childcare than their boomer parents did, even when controlling for maternal employment. This creates tension. They gave their kids the attention and safety they never had. But deep down, many worry they've robbed their children of the independence that made Gen X capable. They remember the competence that came from being forced to solve problems alone, and they're not sure their own kids will develop those skills. The irony is profound. By trying to give their children a better childhood, they may have created new psychological vulnerabilities. Gen X grew strong through adversity and neglect. Their children are growing up protected and monitored. Time will tell which approach produces better outcomes. Here's what makes Gen X truly unique. They're the last generation that remembers life before the internet and the first generation that built life with it. They remember memorizing phone numbers because you had no other choice. They remember being unreachable when you left the house. They remember boredom. Actual, crushing boredom where you had to entertain yourself with nothing but your imagination. But they also adapted to digital life seamlessly. They built the web infrastructure that millennials and Gen Z take for granted. They bridge analog and digital worlds in ways no other generation can. According to Pew Research, Gen X shows lower institutional trust than boomers, but higher trust than millennials. They sit exactly in the middle on almost every trust metric, serving as a bridge between generational worldviews. This positioning creates what sociologists call structural invisibility. Bridge builders don't get much attention. They're just there, holding things together, enabling other people's movements across the gap. Boomers get attention because they're a huge demographic retiring all at once. Millennials get attention because they're struggling economically. Gen Z gets attention because they're new and different. Gen X just works. They don't complain much. They don't post about their challenges. They solve problems quietly and move on. And maybe that's the most Gen X thing of all, not caring if anyone notices. They learned early that the world doesn't owe you recognition. You do the work because the work needs doing, not because you'll get credit for it. So what happens as Gen X ages? They're now in their mid-40s to late 50s, prime leadership years. They hold disproportionate power in corporations, government, and cultural institutions. Their psychological profile, high self-control, defensive pessimism, competence-based respect, brutal honesty, technological fluency, and deep skepticism of institutions, is shaping how organizations function right now. They're less ideological than boomers, more pragmatic than millennials, more skeptical than Gen Z. They don't trust systems, but they understand how systems work well enough to navigate them effectively. According to workplace research, Gen X managers score highest on quiet leadership. They lead through competence and example rather than charisma or vision casting. Their teams report higher autonomy, but also higher accountability. The question is whether Gen X's psychological adaptations, forged through neglect, broken promises, and economic trauma, make them better leaders for an uncertain future, or whether those same adaptations create blind spots. Their self-reliance can become isolation. Their defensive pessimism can become paralysis. Their skepticism of authority can prevent them from wielding authority effectively. Their brutal honesty can damage relationships they don't realize need protecting. But they also bring something essential: resilience without martyrdom, competence without ego, and the rare ability to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously: that systems are fundamentally broken and that we still have to make them work. Generation X may never get the cultural attention that boomers and millennials command. They'll probably never trend on TikTok or dominate political discourse the way other generations do. But they're doing something arguably more important. They're keeping things running while everyone else argues about how things should run. They're the silent architects of the modern world, building systems, fixing problems, and bridging gaps between generations that can barely understand each other. They're not better than other generations. They're not worse. They're just different, shaped by a unique moment when childhood supervision disappeared, institutions crumbled, and economic promises broke. But before the digital safety nets and social media validation structures existed that we now take for granted. If you're Gen X and this resonated, you probably won't share it because that would require posting on social media about yourself, which goes against everything your generation stands for. And that's okay. If you're another generation trying to understand the Gen Zers in your life, your parents, your managers, your colleagues, I hope this helps explain why they are the way they are. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into generational psychology, and consider becoming a channel member to support this kind of research-driven content. I'll see you in the next one.